it's time for Virtual Tabletop Thursday, and today we're going to be looking at a Tabletop Simulator module for Alexander the Great. And you might say, why pick a game from 1974 this week? And some of you may already know the answer, and the answer is this game was actually designed by Gary Gygax. So Gary Gygax's birthday was this week, so in the RPG world, of course, there were tributes and that sort of thing to him, and so for today I thought we would take a look at this module on Tabletop Simulator because it's notable for a couple of interesting reasons. One, the game covers the Battle of Granicus, which of course saw the Macedonians greatly outnumbered by the Persians. I think the Persians brought like 100,000 soldiers, and like 30 or 40,000 of them were on horseback. And Alexander the Great, although not the Great at the time, just Alexander, son of Philip II, showed up with about half that number, maybe a little more, maybe more like 56,000. And so, but he did have some elephants, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. But an interesting game. Both sides can win. Obviously, historically, Alexander the Great won, but as noted in the designer notes, the Persians certainly have a boxer's chance here, a punching chance here. So let's take a look at this module. So first thing is, of course, a really nice look at the board. I think all the assets here were taken maybe from the Vassal module. If you zoom in really far, you can tell they're pretty rough. However, they're still very readable, and that's not always the case when people take the assets out of a Vassal module. So this is sort of notable for that sense, and the board actually retains its fidelity pretty well. Again, you can see some, just sort of weird artifacting around some of the edges of these counters and things like that, but they do still sort of work. And if you've played the game before, you'll instantly recognize it and be able to move forward. Also of note are the fidelity of the charts, which I think was great. So I think everything was kind of taken from, there's a PDF of the first edition of the rule book that has this chart, which actually flips, the combat results table at the front of it, and then some of the additional charts are examples from the rules, and not entirely sure where this one came from. This might be maybe a little more homemade. There's a chart in the rule book that shows this, but I think this one looks like maybe it's a kind of a homemade recreation here for this module. And then of course the different morale status gauge, because of course in this game the morale status actually determines the combat results table that you use. So there are 4 combat result tables. Factor 1, Factor 2, and then here's 3 and 4. And so it's an interesting little take, and then reminders about frontage, and then random direction indicator for the elephants who kind of go do their own thing. That's always sort of a fun rule, right, in these games. The rest of the PDF is included here on the table, and you can click through it with the navigation buttons on the left and right, but you can also click in the upper left. That will give you a pop out onto the screen, which you can use your scroll wheel on your mouse to zip through it like I have here. The reason why I think this is a PDF that was posted to Board Game Geek is it has the same highlighting in place on here. There are a couple of interesting things inside of this that I really like. So since it is Virtual Tabletop Thursday, we're taking a look at these play by mail, and this is something I had heard about. I don't think I'd really seen it in a rule book before. I just knew it was a thing that people had done from listening to interviews and podcasts and things like that. But here you can see Alexander the Great can easily be adapted to play by mail techniques. Merely change all the stock results of 7 to 1, 8 to 2, right? You see that. So other those kind of neat. The play-by-mail pads for Alexander are not available from Avalon Hill. So I guess there were some others that had some play-by-mail pads that could be sent back and forth. But they give some advice here on how to make this happen. And of course, it tells you how to use the stock exchange to resolve your attacks. And you can get that for a mere 50 cents. Whew, getting spendy. I also like this. Now that you know how to play Alexander, the next problem is probably who to play it with. So the long-standing issue of finding someone against whom you could play rears its head here. Folks knew right away from the beginning of the hobby that this is a fun thing to do, but it's even more fun when you can play with somebody else. The nice thing here is that you can see some of Gary Gygax's evolution of his design. So he had 3 designs that came out in 1971, and this was originally published by a different publisher, and I'm forgetting the name of it off the top of my head here, but it was republished by Avalon Hill in 1974, but technically this is a 1971 design. And it's clear that he comes from a miniature background. And many of the things that he does with movement and facing, even the combat resolution with the 4 separate morale charts, I think would have been highly recognizable for miniature gamers. And I like in some ways that he's grown from this sort of miniature tradition into thinking about how to apply that in a board game setting. And it's quite clear that some of the kind of specialty charts that then later show up in later designs, Warlord of Mars and certainly in Dungeons and Dragons, end up showing up on here as well. And so there are some interesting little tidbits in the rules. It's pretty straightforward, readable rule book. The only thing that I would say is that there are a handful of sections in here that get a little more dense. And so the terrain effects chart resolution, this doesn't read particularly well. I think in some cases it can be a little more archaic to read some of these, but there are a number of, even if you don't intend to play this game, the historical summary is nice, and the designer notes give a great insight into why choices were made. And though there's not actually a bibliography in this, the designer notes go through a number of books that influenced the design of the game and why things are the way they are. I also really like the questions and answers on the conduct of play in the back, which is great because it's sort of like, this is a first edition, right? So from Avalon Hill. So these must have been notes that were compiled over the course of 1971 from game release until the republication by Avalon Hill. And instead of like working them into the typeset, it looks like Avalon Hill is kind of like, yeah, we'll just throw those at the end. So there is this kind of interesting little, like, this is what would happen on a forum now, and rather than having the living rule set, it's just been printed right into the back here. And of course we can close this out. Counters flip as you would expect them to. And so that is it for today. So I hope you enjoyed. We're going to do some more virtual Tabletop Thursdays where we take a look at various games. And today, of course, Alexander the Great, 1974, Avalon Hill, designed by the great Gary Gygax.